It was the winter of 1963, and I had just returned to the small fishing village where I was born. The town hadn't changed much since I'd left as a boy. Same crooked streets, same worn-down shacks perched stubbornly along the cliffs, and the same salty tang of the sea hanging in the air. I came back to bury my father, a man I had spent most of my life trying to forget. But grief has a strange way of pulling you home, no matter how far you've run. After the funeral, I stayed on for a few days, sorting through his meager belongings and sleeping in the house I swore I'd never set foot in again. It was small and cold, the wind creeping through the gaps in the wooden walls like a living thing. I didn't want to be there, but something held me back from leaving. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I found myself wandering the village late at night, retracing old steps down paths I hadn't walked in years. On the third night, I decided to take the cliffside trail that led down to the old lighthouse. The path was steep and overgrown, the kind of place no one visits unless they have a reason to. The lighthouse had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, its light extinguished decades ago when the shipping lanes shifted farther out to sea. As a child, I'd always felt drawn to it, sneaking out to sit at its base and stare up at its towering silhouette against the dark sky. It had felt alive back then, like it was watching me, waiting for something. This time, as I approached, the feeling was different. The lighthouse loomed out of the darkness, its blackened stones slick with mist. The door, which had always been bolted shut, was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me across the rocky ground and through the creaking doorway. Inside, the air was heavy, damp, and suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room. The space was empty, just as I'd expected. No furniture, no remnants of its former life, only crumbling walls and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere deep below. I should have left right then, but my eyes caught something unusual. In the center of the floor, there was a hatch I'd never seen before, its iron edges rusted but intact. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I knelt to examine it. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This wasn't something I remembered from childhood. This was new, or maybe hidden. The hatch groaned as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the earth. The darkness below was absolute, swallowing the light of my flashlight as I leaned over the edge. The air that drifted up was colder than the night outside, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I told myself to stop. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant for me, but something deeper than curiosity, something primal, pushed me forward. I climbed down, each step groaning under my weight. The descent felt endless, the sound of my breathing loud and hollow in the confined space. When I finally reached the bottom, the staircase opened into a chamber unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols and figures that looked ancient, far older than the lighthouse itself. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a glass sphere, faintly glowing with a pale blue light. I couldn't look away. The sphere pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I moved closer, my hand reaching out almost involuntarily. The second my fingers brushed its surface, the light flared, blinding me. When my vision cleared, the room was gone. I was standing on the cliff outside, the wind whipping violently around me. The lighthouse was no longer dark. Its light was burning, spinning in slow, deliberate circles across the sea. But it wasn't a beacon of safety. The light was wrong, too bright, too sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. And there, on the edge of the cliff, stood a figure. It was a woman, her back to me, her long hair blowing wildly in the wind. I couldn't see her face, but I felt her presence like a weight pressing against my chest. She turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her profile, and my blood ran cold. It was my mother. But that was impossible. She'd been dead for over 20 years. "Leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled backward, my legs unsteady, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. When I looked up again, she was gone. The light from the lighthouse dimmed and faded, leaving me alone in the darkness. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. My hands were shaking too much to light a fire, so I sat in the cold, staring at the wall until the sun came up. The next day, I packed my things and left without looking back. I don't know what I found in that lighthouse or why it felt like it had been waiting for me, but sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of that glowing sphere, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. And every time I wake up with the same thought: some doors should never be opened. It was a cold January night, the kind where the air stung your lungs and the silence of the world felt heavy, almost alive. Midnight had come and gone, and the streets were deserted, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. Jake and I had left a party not long before, the music and warmth of the crowded room still lingering faintly in my mind. But now, all that was gone. All that was left was the two of us, and the icy darkness stretching ahead. The party had been like so many others, too loud, too crowded, and too chaotic to really enjoy. But it was the kind of place where you felt invincible for a little while, surrounded by strangers and friends, their laughter and energy feeding your own. By the time we decided to leave, the house was a mess, and the people who were left had either passed out or were too drunk to notice us slipping out the front door. The cold hit us like a slap as we stepped outside. Our boots crunched against the frozen snow, and our breath fogged the air in thick clouds. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and shot me a look. "We should have stayed," he muttered. "It's too damn cold for this." "You really want to sleep on that floor?" I shot back. "I'll take the cold." He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Still think this is how horror movies start." I laughed, my voice loud in the stillness. "Then I guess we're the idiots who stick around too long." We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps the only sound. The houses around us grew sparse as we reached the edge of town, their windows dark and lifeless. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his unease spreading to me like static electricity. When we reached the woods, I paused. The shortcut through the trees would save us at least 10 minutes, and I was freezing. "What do you think? Shortcut?" Jake groaned. "Seriously?" "It's the middle of the night." "It's just trees," I said with a grin. "Unless you're scared." He rolled his eyes but followed me anyway, muttering under his breath. That was Jake. Always complaining but never backing down. The woods were different at night. During the day, they were full of life, sunlight filtering through the branches, birds singing overhead. But now, they felt wrong. The bare trees stretched upward like skeletal hands, and the snow muffled every sound, leaving only an oppressive, heavy silence. "You sure this is a good idea?" Jake asked. "It's a shortcut," I said, trying to sound confident. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere to our left. We froze, our breaths visible in the beam of my flashlight. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. "Yeah." I shone the light toward the sound, but the darkness swallowed it. "Probably just a raccoon." Jake shook his head. "Raccoons don't sound like that." We kept walking faster now, the silence pressing harder against us. The snow crunched beneath our boots, and my ears strained for anything, any sound, any movement. That's when we heard the scream. It was high-pitched and sharp, almost human, but not quite. It echoed through the trees, making it impossible to tell where it came from. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What the hell was that?" Jake hissed, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. Then came the growl. Low and deep, it rumbled through the woods, vibrating in my chest. Heavy footsteps followed, deliberate and unrelenting, crunching through the snow behind us. "Run," I said, barely able to get the word out. Jake hesitated. "What?" "Run," I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of the footsteps growing louder behind us. Whatever was chasing us wasn't just fast, it was relentless. Jake stumbled, falling to his knees, and I turned back to help him. That's when I saw it. The flashlight beam caught it for only a second, but that was enough. It was pale and skeletal, its impossibly long limbs moving in unnatural jerks. Its skin was stretched so thin I could see the outline of its bones. But the face was the worst part, no eyes, just empty sockets, and a mouth full of jagged yellow teeth. Jake screamed, scrambling to his feet as I shoved him forward. "Go!" I shouted. We ran until the trees thinned and we burst out onto the street. The warm glow of the streetlights felt like salvation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. I glanced back, expecting to see it lunging after us, but it had stopped at the edge of the woods. It stood there, watching us, its head tilted as if it were curious. Then, without a sound, it turned and melted back into the shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached my house. Once inside, we locked the door, barricading it with the couch. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, too shaken to speak. "You saw it, right?" Jake finally whispered. "Tell me I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. The next morning, we went back. I don't know why. Maybe we needed proof, or maybe we wanted to convince ourselves it wasn't real. What we found chilled us to the core. Claw marks raked across the trees, gouges in the snow, and footprints, huge, impossibly spaced, leading deeper into the forest. We never talked about it again. But sometimes, on cold, quiet nights, I think about those empty sockets watching us from the edge of the woods, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. So if you ever find yourself in the woods on a dark night and hear something behind you, don't stop, don't look back, just run. I'm a 21-year-old boy, and this story took place when I was 11 years old. I still remember it clearly, because it was the first time my parents allowed me to walk to school and back home by myself. It felt like a big deal at the time, like a rite of passage. Up until I turned 14, my family and I lived in what we believed was a safe and friendly neighborhood in Chaka County, New York. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and if you did something wrong, word would reach your parents before you even got home. That's why I always felt secure, like nothing bad could happen there. The day this happened was in the middle of winter. It had snowed heavily the night before, and even though the ground was covered in knee-high snow, school was still open. My friends and I weren't thrilled about having to trudge through all that snow, but we didn't have a choice. Normally, I would walk with my older brother, who was 3 years older than me. He always knew the best routes to school, avoiding icy sidewalks and deep snowbanks. But that day, he was sick and couldn't go to school. My mom offered to drop me off, but I insisted I was old enough to walk alone. I remember feeling proud and confident, as though walking by myself was proof I was growing up. Before I left, my mom hesitated. She put her hand on my shoulder and reminded me to pay attention to the cars. She had good reason to worry. When I was 9, I was hit by a car while playing near the street, and since then, she'd been extra cautious. I nodded quickly, impatient to leave, and reassured her I'd be careful. Then I put on my coat and boots, grabbed my backpack, and headed out. Since I didn't have my brother rushing me along, I decided to take my time. I kicked at the snow as I walked, enjoying the crunching sound beneath my boots. I played in the brown slush that had gathered on the sides of the road, shaping it into messy snowballs and throwing them as far as I could. It felt freeing to walk alone, like I had all the time in the world. But as I got closer to school, something caught my attention. A white van driving slowly behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was just a coincidence that the van was heading in the same direction as me. But when I bent down to make another snowball, I noticed it creeping along at a snail's pace. The sight of it made me uneasy, but I shook it off. Maybe the driver was just lost, or driving cautiously because of the snow. I quickened my pace, telling myself there was nothing to worry about. When I finally reached the school, I glanced over my shoulder. The van had stopped a few feet behind me. I couldn't see who was inside because of the tinted windows, but I felt like someone was watching me. My heart was racing as I stepped onto the school grounds, and just then, the van sped away. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Throughout the day, I kept seeing the van. Whenever I looked out the classroom window, there it was, parked on the street with its engine off. It wasn't parked in the same spot each time, but I recognized it instantly, because of a bright yellow smiley face sticker on the back. My teachers didn't seem to notice, and I didn't say anything to anyone. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, but deep down, I felt uneasy. When school ended, I wasn't excited to go home like I usually was. My mom was at work, and my brother was still sick, so I had to walk back alone. I tried to blend in with the other kids leaving school, hoping to feel less anxious, but most of them were car riders or lived in the different directions. I decided to take a different route home, remembering how my brother always said it was safer to switch things up. The new path was unfamiliar, but I figured it was better than risking being followed again. Unfortunately, I didn't plan the route well and ended up back on the main street, the same one I'd taken in the morning. My stomach dropped when I saw the white van parked behind a row of cars. It was like they had been waiting for me. I tried to act normal, walking past the van as casually as I could, but then I heard the faint sound of the van door sliding open. That's when I panicked. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my boots sinking into the snow with every step. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, and it felt like they were getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breaths came out in short, panicked bursts. I didn't know what else to do, so I started cutting through people's backyards, hoping to lose them. The snow was deep, and my legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I didn't stop. I finally reached my house, my boots slipping on the icy driveway, and banged on the front door with all my strength. My brother opened the door, looking confused and startled. The moment he saw my face, though, he knew something was wrong. He pulled me inside and locked the door behind me. I peeked out the window and saw the van parked on the street outside our house. It didn't leave until my dad got home later that evening. We never talked about it much after that day, but we all knew how close I had come to being in serious danger. Years later, a friend from my hometown sent me a news article about some men who had been targeting kids in our area back then. The article mentioned a white van, and it gave me chills. I'll never forget that van with the smiley face sticker, and I'm just grateful I made it home that day.